The immortal piano melody of Layla was a cover-up, a perfect, beautiful cover-up for a brutal truth. The mind that created it was rotten from the inside. Jim Gordon was not a genius. He was a time bomb, the world's greatest drummer, and a murderer in waiting. And that hammer murder? That was not a tragedy. That was the inevitable detonation of a bomb that everyone ignored. Our story begins in the place where the armor was forged, in the deceptive, sun-bleached suburbs of post-war Los Angeles. James Beck Gordon was born on July 14, 1945, in the San Fernando Valley. Post-war Los Angeles was a city of schizophrenic contradictions. It was the land of sunshine and orange groves, the dream factory of Hollywood, a place where a new, gleaming American middle class was being born in sprawling suburbs. But underneath this veneer, it was the world of film noir, of Raymond Chandler, a place of hidden darkness, transient populations, and profound loneliness. Jim Gordon was born directly into that loneliness. His first wound, the first invisible part of his life, was the man who wasn't there. His father was a ghost, an unknown name, an absent shadow in a world of post-war fathers returning to their families. Jim was the only child of a single mother, Osa Marie Gordon. In the 1950s, this wasn't just a challenge. It was a stigma. It was a quiet scandal, a defining social marker that set their small, two-person household apart from the normal world of the valley. This feeling of abandonment, of being incomplete, would become a central driving force in his life. He was a boy without a normal anchor, a boy watching the world of normal families from the outside. This feeling, this background role, as he would later see it, festered. It was a childhood shadow that would one day metastasize, twisting his perception of his role in bands, his paranoia over songwriting credits, his relationships, and his place in the world. He was from the start the invisible boy, defined by what was missing. Osa Marie, his mother, was not a typical 1950s suburban housewife. She was a complex, intelligent, and, in many ways, tragic figure herself. She was a classically trained, highly skilled jazz pianist. She had lived the life, breathed the air of the Hollywood jazz scene, a world of smoky clubs, bohemian artists, and creative fire. But by the time Jim was a child, that world was dying. The big bands were gone, the jazz clubs were closing, and a new, raucous teenage sound called rock and roll was taking over. Osa Marie was a woman clinging to a past that had no future, living in a present she didn't quite fit into. She was a single parent, her own ambitions as a musician likely curtailed by the reality of raising a son alone. She was a woman of discipline, of order. Her entire world was built on control, and she intended to build her son's world the same way. The Gordon household was not a quiet one. It was filled with music, but it was her music. It was the sound of her piano, the sound of classical discipline, Bach, Beethoven, Chopin. It was the sound of her old jazz records, Buddy Rich, Gene Krupa, the gods of a more sophisticated technical era. She saw this as Jim's inheritance. He would be respectable. He would be a proper musician. He would learn the piano. For young Jim, this was not an invitation. It was a prison. He was forced onto the piano bench. He was taught the scales, the theory, the classical rigidity, and he hated it. He hated the structure. He hated the lack of freedom. It felt like an extension of his mother's control, her way of forcing him into the normal life that his absent father had denied them. But there was another sound in the house, a rebellious sound, leaking in from the outside world. It came from the radio, from stations like KFWB. It was the raw, primal, undeniable pulse of early rock and roll. It was Little Richard's scream, Fats Domino's rolling rhythm, and most importantly, it was the sound of the drums. While Osa Marie heard noise, Jim heard liberation. While she heard chaos, he heard a different kind of order. It was a visceral, physical, powerful sound. He was listening to his mother's jazz records, but he wasn't hearing the melodies she loved. He was isolating the drums. He was transfixed by the sheer explosive technique of Buddy Rich, the polyrhythmic genius of Gene Krupa. This was a sound that wasn't background. It was the engine. It was the heartbeat. It was the one thing you couldn't ignore. At the age of 8, the rebellion began. He wanted a drum kit. Osa Marie was, by all accounts, horrified. This was the opposite of her dream. The piano was an instrument of composition, of sophistication. The drums were an instrument of noise, of rhythm, of rock and roll. It was the sound of the world she felt was beneath her, but Jim was relentless. The quiet, invisible boy had found his voice, and it was loud. Eventually she relented. A drum kit was acquired, and the moment he sat behind it, the world made sense. This was not a hobby. This was a transfiguration. This was the invisible boy suddenly becoming the most powerful person in the room. This was the boy with no control. Suddenly, in total control of the rhythm, the tempo, the very pulse of the music. He was a natural, a prodigy. He wasn't just banging, he was playing. He was self-taught, absorbing the complexity of his jazz idols and applying it to the energy of rock. By the age of 10, around 1955, he was already playing in local school bands. But he wasn't like the other kids. They were fumbling through basic rock beats. He was already experimenting, fusing the jazz he'd inherited from his mother's records with the rock he loved. But this new identity, this drummer, only deepened his isolation. At school, in the hyper-masculine 1950s suburban world of football and conformity, he was an outcast. He wasn't just the quiet kid. He wasn't just the kid with no dad. He was now the jazz kid, the drum kid. He was bullied, seen as strange, a misfit who didn't belong. This only pushed him further into his sanctuary, the garage, the bedroom. He would practice for hours, 8, 9, 10 hours a day. It was an obsession. It was a refuge. The drums were the one place where his status as an outsider felt like a strength. The one place where his internal world, so full of frustration and a yearning to be seen, could be channeled into something powerful and undeniable. He was building his identity, note by note, beat by beat. And then, just as his new life was beginning, just as he was becoming a somebody, his mind, his own brain, betrayed him in the most terrifying way imaginable. We don't know the exact day, there is no record, but we know it happened in his mid-teens. He was around 17 years old, around 1962. He was alone, maybe in his bedroom practicing, maybe at school, walking down a hall, and he heard it. It wasn't a sound from the outside. It was a sound from the inside, a whisper, a voice. It was not his own thoughts. It was something else, something alien, intrusive, and clear as a bell. Imagine the sheer, paralyzing terror of that moment. This is 1961. The world has no nuanced understanding of mental health. There is no public discourse. There is only one word for this: madness. It is the word of institutions, of straitjackets, of ruined lives. It is the ultimate stigma, the ultimate secret. He was a teenager, already bullied, already feeling like an outsider. This was confirmation of his deepest fear. He was not just different, he was broken. He was crazy. The paranoia which would come to define his life bloomed in that instant. Who could he tell? His mother? Osa Marie, the woman obsessed with control and normalcy? The woman who, according to Joel Selvin's 2023 book, Drums and Demons, had already been ignoring the more subtle, early warning signs. The social withdrawal, the flashes of irrational anger, the obsessive behavior, dismissing them as simple teenage moods. He knew instinctively that telling her was not an option. She would not understand. She would be horrified. She would perhaps try to have him fixed. He would be exposed. His one dream, the drums, the only thing that made him feel powerful, would be taken away. So in that moment of terror, 16-year-old Jim Gordon made the single most important and most tragic decision of his entire life. He would tell no one. He hid it, buried it, and built a wall of pure talent around it. This is the birth of the reliable pro. This is the moment his obsession with drumming transformed from a passion into a desperate psychological defense mechanism. His practice sessions, already long, became superhuman. His goal was no longer just to be good. His goal was to be perfect. He would become the most controlled, the most precise, the most versatile drummer on earth. He would use his musical genius as an armor. If his mind was in chaos, his drumming would be the picture of perfect order. If his mind was unreliable, his hands and feet would be the most reliable machine in any room. He would perform sanity so convincingly that no one would ever guess the war that was raging behind his eyes. This decision, made in fear by a sick teenager, would define the rest of his life. It was the seed of his greatest triumphs and the direct, unalterable path to his final, horrifying downfall. With this new, secret, desperate resolve, the world of high school, the world of normal life, became intolerable. It was a charade. His mother's dream of a proper education was a joke. The only education he cared about was the one that would save him, the one that would build his armor. In 1961, at 16, he made the decision to leave school and pursue music full-time. This was his escape, his declaration of independence. He was now a professional musician. He dove into the only world that made sense, the gritty, competitive, all-night world of the Sunset Strip. This wasn't the psychedelic flower power Sunset Strip of 1967. This was the pre-Beatles era. It was a world of jazz holdovers, greasy R&B clubs, and nascent rock and roll. It was a world of sharks, a world that would eat a 16-year-old kid alive. But Jim wasn't just any kid. He was a prodigy. And he was a prodigy with a terrifying secret to protect. He started getting gigs, small clubs, backing bands. He was the kid, the virtuoso who could play anything. He was already fusing his mother's jazz with the rock and roll the clubs demanded. He was versatile. He was precise. He was, above all, reliable. But it was a grind. He wasn't a star. He was once again the invisible man. To make ends meet, he took a day job. He was a delivery boy. This duality defined his existence. By day, he was a literal nobody, a background player, hauling packages around Los Angeles, an invisible boy in a uniform. By night, he was a god, sitting behind his kit, the engine of the band, in total perfect control. This tension, this session anonymity, fueled his frustration. It echoed his childhood, his absent father, his background role in his own home. He was desperate to prove himself, to be a lead role, to be seen. But in the meantime, he was learning. He was networking. And the people he was playing with, the other invisible musicians in those clubs and small studios, were not just any players. They were the early foundational members of a group that would soon have a name. They were the precursors to the Wrecking Crew. Jim Gordon, the 16-year-old dropout, the delivery boy, the jazz kid, the boy who was terrified he was going insane, was on the verge of breaking in. He was about to become a ghost in the most powerful hit-making machine the world had ever seen. The armor was holding, the performance was working, but the voices were getting louder, and the world he was about to enter, the pressure cooker of the Hollywood studio scene, was a world that would not only test his armor, it would provide him with the very tools, the drugs, the excess, the culture of denial that would one day help him destroy it. Ironically, before that machine could destroy him, it needed him to build it. And the sound of that construction is the sound of Armageddon. It's the sound of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, the pinnacle of 1960s pop production. And the engine, the thunder, the man providing that perfectly controlled, earth-shattering percussion was that 17-year-old kid. He hadn't just joined the music scene. He was conscripted into a war. The war was for radio dominance. The generals were producers like Phil Spector, and the foot soldiers were the Wrecking Crew, that elite fraternity of invisible musicians he had finally broken into. Jim Gordon, with his jazz fusion chops, his obsessive precision, and his desperate secret need to appear reliable, was not just another soldier. He was their new secret weapon. The Wrecking Crew was the invisible hand that shaped the sound of the 1960s. They were a shadowy collective, a fraternity of musical assassins who moved from studio to studio, often playing on 3 or 4 different #1 hits in a single day for different artists, on different labels. When Jim Gordon entered this world in 1962, he was the new kid, the prodigy, but he was entering a Shark Tank. The established first call drummer was the legendary Hal Blaine, the king. Jim was the young lion, the kid with the technical fire and the jazz-inflected rhythms that the older players didn't possess. Producers, especially Phil Spector, weren't just looking for a beat, they were looking for an architect. Spector, famously tyrannical, was building his wall of sound at Gold Star Studios. This wasn't music, it was sonic warfare. He would cram dozens of musicians into one small room, 4 guitarists, 3 bassists, 2 pianos, and, crucially, multiple drummers all playing the exact same part in perfect, thunderous unison. For a producer, this demanding good wasn't good enough. You had to be perfect. One mistake and you were out, not just for the take, but for good. The pressure was immense. It was a crucible designed to break lesser musicians. For Jim Gordon, it was sanctuary. This is the central tragic irony of his life. For most, this pressure was a nightmare. For Jim, it was a relief. The chaos raging inside his head, the voices, the paranoia, the creeping, formless terror was so much louder, so much more terrifying than any tantrum Phil Spector could throw. The studio, with its rigid rules, its clear demands, and its requirement of absolute perfection, was the one place on earth where he was in control. The voices couldn't command him when he was listening to the click track. The paranoia couldn't consume him when he was focused on executing a flawless 30-second note fill. His drumming, his armor of perfect, reliable professionalism, became his salvation. He wasn't just playing the part, he was hiding inside it. And he was a genius. He wasn't just a machine, he was a creator. Producers loved him because he didn't just play what was on the page, he elevated it. He brought his jazz sensibilities, his polyrhythms, his complex, syncopated hi-hat work to simple pop songs, giving them a depth and sophistication they would never have otherwise possessed. He became one of Spector's go-to guys. He played on many of Spector's sessions, including Ike and Tina Turner's monumental River Deep Mountain High. But he was always the ghost. He was uncredited. He was the anonymous engine in a sound attributed solely to Spector. This was the deal. You got paid well, but you didn't exist. For a man whose entire childhood was defined by being the invisible boy, this was a dangerous bargain. It reinforced his deepest fear that his contribution, his genius, was destined to be unheard, unseen, and unacknowledged. This bargain became even more pronounced when he was called in by the one producer who was Spector's equal in genius, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. This is not a rock and roll beat. This is something else. It's a heartbeat. It's a delicate, complex, and emotionally resonant piece of orchestration. He played on later Beach Boys sessions, during Brian Wilson's creative peak around the Pet Sounds era. The rhythm is a loping, almost limping, jazz-inflected beat that perfectly mirrors the song's feeling of hopeful, vulnerable devotion. He's using sleigh bells, tempo blocks, and a crisp snare in a way no rock drummer had before. His playing is part of a vast modular collage of sound across the entire Pet Sounds era sessions. He was, by all measures, at the absolute pinnacle of his art. He was playing on the most important, most artistically significant records of the decade. He was the secret ingredient. And no one knew his name. He was 21 years old, a musical giant, and a complete unknown. He was making hundreds of records, dozens of which were massive hits. He played on the Byrds' Mr. Tambourine Man, on records for the Mamas and the Papas, on Sonny and Cher's I Got You Babe. He was quite literally the sound of the 60s, and all the while the armor was holding. But it was taking a toll. The Wrecking Crew scene and the larger Hollywood music world was awash in drugs. It was the 60s. Marijuana, amphetamines, and increasingly cocaine were not just recreational, they were tools of the trade. They were fuel, speed to stay awake for a 20-hour stretch of sessions, marijuana and alcohol to come down. For Jim, this was not a party. It was, as it had been from the start, self-medication. The drugs he discovered were a new layer of armor. They were a way to manage the illness. The cocaine, a powerful stimulant, could focus his mind, giving him a laser-sharp clarity that cut through the fog of paranoia, allowing him to execute his perfect, precise takes. The alcohol and marijuana could muffle the voices, could take the edge off the terror, could allow him to appear cool and relaxed in a scene that valued effortless style. He was building a house of cards. The very medicine he was using to mask the symptoms was gasoline on the fire of the underlying disease. Schizophrenia is a disease of brain chemistry. Pumping his system full of powerful, mood-altering, psychoactive chemicals was a slow-motion catastrophe. It was accelerating the illness, making the baseline paranoia worse, making the voices more intrusive when the drugs wore off. But on the outside, the performance was flawless. He was the reliable pro, the guy who always showed up, always had his gear tuned, always nailed the take. He was also, by this time, a young man in love. And this, more than the drugs, more than the studio pressure, would become the first, most dangerous crack in his armor. Her name was Rita Coolidge. She was not yet the star she would become. When they met around 1968, she was a young, stunningly beautiful, and incredibly talented aspiring singer. Jim Gordon, the 20-year-old session king, the quiet, handsome virtuoso, was at the center of the musical universe. They fell into a passionate, intense, and deeply volatile relationship. This was the first time his invisible status truly began to torture him. He was the secret force behind the biggest hits in the world, but she was the one moving towards the spotlight. She was a singer, a face, a name. As her star began to rise, as she began to get her own gigs and make her own connections, his paranoia, that core childhood wound of being the background player, began to fixate on her. He became jealous, possessive. He saw her ambition not as a shared goal, but as a threat. He was the one with the real genius, he felt, but she was the one who was going to be famous. This jealousy, this insecurity, this paranoia was not just the normal, immature reaction of a young man. It was the illness. The schizophrenia was latching onto a real-life situation and twisting it, poisoning it, turning his love for her into a complex paranoid delusion of betrayal. He was becoming convinced that she was using him, that she didn't really love him, that she, like everyone else, was just overlooking his true contribution. He was hiding all this, of course. Hiding it from her, hiding it from the wrecking crew, hiding it from his producers. But the pressure was building. The reliable pro was beginning to show tiny erratic cracks. He was also beginning to work with the one musician who was as obsessive, as technically demanding, and as eccentric as he was, Frank Zappa. Zappa, the iconoclastic genius, had no interest in 3-minute pop songs. He was writing music that was a chaotic, brilliant fusion of rock, jazz, doo-wop, and avant-garde classical. It was music of impossible time signatures, of comedic, absurd complexity. It was music that most rock drummers couldn't even understand, let alone play. And Zappa loved Jim Gordon. He hired Gordon to play on his seminal 1969 album Hot Rats, and would use him again on albums like Apostrophe. For Zappa, Gordon was the perfect tool. He was a human metronome with the soul of a jazz man. He was a studio gun who could execute Frank's most bizarre, complex musical ideas with flawless, cold precision. For Jim, this was the ultimate validation of his pro armor. If he could play Zappa's music, he wasn't just reliable, he was a virtuoso. This work was, in many ways, the pinnacle of his session man identity. The complex, fusion-heavy drumming he was doing with Zappa was groundbreaking. He was, along with a handful of others, inventing the entire genre of jazz rock drumming. But this, too, was a trap. With Zappa, he was, once again, a tool. He was the invisible backbone. He was an employee executing the vision of another, greater genius. Reportedly, he was never paid royalties for this groundbreaking work, just his flat session fee. He was too professional to complain, too afraid of being seen as difficult. He was still the kid from the wrecking crew, the ghost in the machine. By 1968, Jim Gordon was 23 years old. He had played on over 100 gold records. He had defined the sound of the most important pop music of his time, from the Beach Boys to Frank Zappa. By all accounts, he was a profoundly miserable and terrified man. His relationship with Rita Coolidge was disintegrating in a fog of jealousy and paranoid accusations. His drug use was escalating. The voices, once a whisper, were now a constant murmuring chorus, a background static of dread and persecution. The armor of the reliable pro had become a golden prison. He was the most successful, most respected, invisible man in the world. He was tired of being a ghost. He was tired of being a gun for hire. He was tired of being the engine for other people's dreams. He was desperate for a change. He didn't just want to be on the record. He wanted his name on the record. He wanted to be in a band. He wanted, for the first time in his life, to step out of the shadows and into the spotlight. He was about to get his wish, and it would be the single most glorious and the single most destructive thing that would ever happen to him. A new tour was forming, a traveling circus of rock and soul musicians called Delaney and Bonnie and Friends. It was a loose, collaborative, and electrifyingly raw antidote to the slick studio world, and they needed a rhythm section. Jim Gordon, the king of the studio, the master of control, was about to leave his fortress and join the chaos of the road. And on that tour, he would meet a man who was also fleeing his own past, a man who was looking for a new, authentic sound, a man named Eric Clapton. The stage was being set for a new band, a band that would, for a brief, brilliant, and tragic moment, burn as brightly as the sun. A band called Derek and the Dominos. The invisible boy was about to become a star, and the voices were coming with him. This is the sound of chaos, but it's a joyful chaos. This is the sound Jim Gordon, desperately hiding his escalating schizophrenia, fled the sterile, windowless rooms of LA to find. By 1969, this traveling circus truly was the absolute antithesis of the Wrecking Crew. Their music wasn't about perfect, controlled takes. It was about feeling. It was sweaty, improvisational, and dangerously alive. When Jim, the king of precision, signed on as drummer, he found he wasn't alone. The rhythm section he joined was, in itself, a supergroup in waiting. On bass was Carl Rattle, a quiet, solid, intuitive player from Oklahoma, the anchor in the storm. On keyboards and vocals was Bobby Whitlock, a fiery, soulful singer and player from Memphis. Instantly a bond was forged. This was his band. This was his tribe. Jim, with his Wrecking Crew precision, became the engine of their joyful chaos. He was at last seen. He wasn't just a studio gun. He was a member. And then the other refugee arrived. Eric Clapton, disgusted with the god status and the suffocating hype of Cream and Blind Faith, saw Delaney and Bonnie and friends perform. He was transfixed. This was the raw, soulful American sound he had been chasing his entire life. In a move that shocked the music world, God did the unthinkable. He asked to join the band as a simple, anonymous rhythm guitarist. For the duration of that tour, Eric Clapton stood on the side of the stage, a humble sideman, just to be a part of that sound. And every single night, the man he was watching, the man who was driving that entire locomotive, was Jim Gordon. He wasn't just hearing a drummer, he was feeling a co-conspirator. He was hearing Gordon's power, his complexity, his fusion of raw rock energy and sophisticated jazz precision. It was the exact sound Clapton had been dreaming of. That tour was a fiery, brilliant, and chemically fueled blur. It was also, inevitably, too chaotic to last. Delaney and Bonnie's marriage was fracturing, and the band was disintegrating. When the dust settled, Clapton, the quiet observer, made his move. He knew he had found what he was looking for. He wasn't just going to join a band, he was going to build one. And he was going to build it from the rhythm section he had just spent 6 months playing with. In early 1970, he poached them, Jim Gordon, Carl Rattle, and Bobby Whitlock. Imagine this moment for Jim Gordon, the invisible boy from the valley, the sax geek who got bullied, the ghost in the Wrecking Crew. God had just walked up to him and said, "I'm starting a new band, and I want you to be its foundation." This was not a session gig. This was a partnership. He was a founder. He was at last stepping out of the shadows. He was going to be a star. They flew to England, moving into Clapton's Grand Surrey estate, Hurtwood Edge. This was not a band rehearsal. It was an emotional bunker. Clapton was a man in torment. He was in the throes of a devastating, unrequited, and all-consuming obsession with Pattie Boyd, the wife of his best friend, George Harrison. The music they began to write in that isolated English countryside was not just music. It was a primal scream. It was the sound of Clapton's yearning, his guilt, his desperation. And Jim Gordon, Carl Rattle, and Bobby Whitlock were the vessel for this pain. Jim especially was a co-creator. He was arranging, he was building the grooves. The song Bell Bottom Blues was born from this period, a song Jim Gordon would later claim to have co-written. The band needed a name. They were, for a time, Eric Clapton and Friends, but they all hated it. They were a band, a democratic unit. The story goes that they were jokingly called Del and the Dominos. It stuck. Derek and the Dominos sounded humble, anonymous. It was the perfect disguise for a band made of gods. In August 1970, they flew to Miami, to the legendary Criteria Studios, to record their one and only album. The producer was the legendary Tom Dowd, the man who had engineered masterpieces for Ray Charles and John Coltrane. The atmosphere in that studio was not one of creation. It was a cauldron. It was, by all accounts, a toxic, brilliant, and emotional inferno. Eric Clapton, his obsession with Patti now at a fever pitch, was descending rapidly into a full-blown heroin addiction. The rest of the band, in a desperate attempt to keep up, to match his intensity and to simply survive the emotional pressure, ran on a tidal wave of cocaine. For a normal, healthy person, this environment would be destructive. For a man with undiagnosed, untreated paranoid schizophrenia, it was the worst possible place on earth. The drugs and the sleepless nights were not just partying. They were pure gasoline on the fire of Jim's illness. His reliable pro armor was the only thing he had left. He was, by all accounts, a machine during the day. He'd sit behind the kit, and the paranoia, the voices, the terror would be channeled into the music. Listen to the album. His drumming is not just good, it is unhinged. It's a man on a wire. It's breathtakingly precise, yet filled with a desperate, manic energy. The grooves on Keep On Growing or Why Does Love Got to Be So Sad are telepathic. The band was locking in, feeding off Clapton's raw, lovesick pain and their own chemical-fueled intensity. But they were missing a piece. Tom Dowd, sensing they needed a new spark, took Clapton to a local concert, the Allman Brothers Band. Clapton sat on the floor and watched the slide guitar prodigy, Duane Allman. He saw a mirror of himself, a musician of such profound, soulful, and blistering talent that he knew instantly he had to have him. Duane was invited to the studio. The two guitar gods, God and Sky Dog, sat on the floor, trading licks. The Dominos, Jim Gordon included, watched in awe. The band was now complete. The pressure cooker had just been sealed. They were cutting the album's centerpiece, the title track, Layla. It was a primal 7-chord rock and roll scream from Clapton to Patti. It was a fantastic song. It was aggressive. It was desperate. It was, they all felt, finished. But the story wasn't over. One night deep into the sessions, the studio was dark. Jim Gordon was not sleeping. He hadn't slept really in days. He was 25 years old, wired on a mountain of cocaine, and crucially, he was in a full-blown, acute, manic episode of his schizophrenia. His own life was mirroring Clapton's. His volatile, obsessive, and now finished relationship with Rita Coolidge had become the focal point of his illness. He was paranoid. He was heartbroken. He was, in his mind, the true victim of unrequited, betrayed love. His paranoia had convinced him that she had used him, that she had betrayed him, that she had stolen from him. He was, in that moment, a man at war with his own mind. The voices, the delusions, the invisible wounds of his entire life, they were all screaming at him. He wandered into a separate, empty studio room. There was a piano. He sat down, and he began to play. What came out of him was not rock and roll. It was not the blues. It was Osa Marie's music. It was the classical music his mother had forced into his hands as a child. The discipline he had hated, the structure he had rebelled against, was now, in this moment of absolute mental chaos, the only language he had to express a feeling so profound, so tragic, that it had no words. He was playing this beautiful, mournful, complex, classical-inspired melody. It was the sound of his pain. It was his Layla. It was the sound of his own private, paranoid heartbreak. Tom Dowd, in the control room, heard it. He stopped. Eric Clapton, in the hallway, heard it. He stopped dead. This was not the sound of a drummer. This was the sound of a composer. Clapton ran into the room. What is that? Jim, still lost in his manic, psychotic state, barely registered. He was just playing. It was, he would later say, just something he had. Clapton knew. This was not a new song. This was the other half of Layla. This was the release. This was the plea, the aftermath to his raw, rocking scream. It was the missing piece. A few nights later, the band, with Duane Allman playing that haunting bird call slide guitar over the top, recorded it. Tom Dowd, in an act of production genius, painstakingly edited the raw, rocking Layla to the beautiful, tragic Layla coda. A masterpiece was born. Jim Gordon was not just the drummer. He was not just a founder. He was the officially credited co-writer of the greatest song of their career. He was finally visible, though that authorship would be fiercely debated for decades. And then the second and most fatal part of the tragedy occurred. Rita Coolidge was also in Miami. She was working at Criteria Studios at the same time, singing on other projects within the same musical circle. She heard the melody, and in a story that is now hopelessly poisoned by myth, by what-ifs, and by Jim's own illness, a new narrative was born. Coolidge would later claim, and has claimed for decades, that she and Jim had written a song together years before, a song called Time, and that the Layla coda was that song, that she was, in fact, the uncredited co-writer. For Jim Gordon, a man already in the grips of a paranoid delusion that Rita was betraying him, that she was stealing from him. This was the ultimate, terrifying, reality-shattering proof. The paranoia was not a delusion. It was real. She was stealing from him. She was trying to take his one true, immortal creation. Was she? The truth is lost. Joel Selvin's book Drums and Demons argues forcefully that this was a myth she capitalized on, a story she told that perhaps she even came to believe. Bobby Whitlock, the keyboardist, has furiously denied it, stating clearly Jim wrote that, all of it. But it doesn't matter what the truth was. All that matters is what Jim believed. He was too sick, too high, too intimidated to fight. He was still the invisible boy at heart, the reliable pro who doesn't make waves. The credit on the album was correctly Clapton/Gordon. But in Jim's mind, the damage was done. The betrayal was complete. His paranoia and reality had just fused into one indistinguishable nightmare. The album Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs was released in November 1970. It was credited to Derek and the Dominos, a name no one knew. Clapton's face wasn't on the cover. It was a complete critical and commercial bomb. It failed, utterly. The band, shattered, exhausted, and chemically destroyed, embarked on a U.S. tour to support an album no one was buying. It was, by all accounts, a death march. It was a descent into the absolute worst, darkest, most joyless pit of rock and roll excess. Clapton, devastated by the album's failure and Patty's continued rejection, was a full-blown, non-functional heroin addict. He was a ghost, a zombie, playing with his back to the audience. The rest of the band, led by Jim Gordon, ran on a blizzard of cocaine. But the reliable pro was dead. The armor was gone. Jim Gordon, on that 1971 tour, was a man who had completely unraveled. He was no longer hiding his illness. He was acting it out. He was terrifying. He was openly, violently paranoid. He was convinced the roadies were sabotaging his kit. He was convinced the other band members were plotting against him. He got into a fistfight with Bobby Whitlock. He was erratic, abusive, and totally lost. He was reportedly hearing the voices on stage shouting at him over the sound of his own drums. The music, once so telepathic, became a joyless, chaotic sludge. The band was a financial and emotional catastrophe. In the middle of the tour, Clapton, a broken man, simply quit. He got on a plane, went back to Hurtwood Edge, and locked the door. He would not be seen again for almost 2 years, lost in a heroin haze. Derek and the Dominos, the most brilliant band in the world, was over. It had lasted less than a year. For Jim Gordon, this was the end of the world. This was his one shot, his chance to be a star, his chance to be seen. And it had exploded, taking his sanity with it. He was left in the wreckage. He was a 26-year-old man, a co-writer of a failed masterpiece, and his mind was in ruins. He flew back to Los Angeles. His dream was dead. And then the final cruel, ironic twist. In 1972, a year after the band had destroyed itself, Atlantic Records re-released Layla as a single. This time, the world listened. It was a staggering global #1 smash hit. It was everywhere. Jim Gordon was now officially a Grammy-winning, world-famous songwriter. He was a rock star, but it was all poison. The band was dead. Clapton was gone. The fame was for a song he believed had been stolen from him. It was a success that proved in his fractured mind that the conspiracy was real. It was the ultimate horrifying validation of his deepest, darkest, paranoid delusion. He had the fame, he had the royalties, and he was in his soul more lost and more terrified than he had ever been. He had to go back. He had to hide. He had to rebuild the armor. He returned to the only place he had ever felt safe, the only place that could contain the chaos. He went back to the studio. He went back to being a ghost. But the man who returned was not the reliable pro who had left. The man who returned was haunted. This is the sound of an armor being rebuilt. It's the sound of Jim Gordon in the 1970s, the Golden Ghost. When Jim Gordon returned to Los Angeles in 1972, he was a walking, breathing, Grammy-winning paradox. He was a 27-year-old rock star, co-writer of Layla, one of the biggest songs on earth. And he was a man completely, terrifyingly, and secretly unhinged. The Derek and the Dominos experiment, his one shot at escaping the invisible life, had failed catastrophically. It had put him in the spotlight, and that light had almost burned him alive, exposing his illness and shattering his defenses. He was a refugee, and he fled back to the only sanctuary he had ever known, the dark, windowless, controlled environment of the studio. He didn't just go back to session work. He became the session work. He didn't just rebuild his reliable pro armor. He built a fortress. He was once again the studio gun. But now he wasn't just the wrecking crew prodigy. He was Jim Gordon, the legend, the man who had played in a band with God. The 1970s were on paper the absolute pinnacle of Jim Gordon's career. The phone was ringing off the hook. The work was his for the taking. And the work was not just jingles or pop songs. It was with the gods of the industry. He was no longer just a sideman. He was a peer, an equal. He was the first call drummer for the solo Beatles. He became George Harrison's go-to guy, the rhythmic heart of Harrison's spiritual and commercial peak. That gentle, loping, perfectly understated beat on Give Me Love, that's Jim Gordon. He's the foundation of the entire Living in the Material World album. He played on John Lennon's Walls and Bridges, driving the #1 hit, Whatever Gets You Through the Night. He was the anchor for Lennon's Lost Weekend, a man who could provide stability for music's most famously chaotic figures. He returned to the Beach Boys, now as a celebrated equal, to play on their classic Sail On Sailor. He returned to Frank Zappa, a man who only worked with the absolute best, to lay down the mind-bending jazz fusion grooves on the Apostrophe album, including the iconic Don't Eat the Yellow Snow. His discography from this period is quite simply insane. It's a who's who of 70s rock royalty. Steely Dan's Pretzel Logic, Harry Nilsson's Jump Into the Fire, albums for Ringo Starr, Jackson Browne, Tom Petty, Alice Cooper, Carly Simon. He was, without question, the invisible rhythmic backbone of the entire 1970s LA sound. The reliable pro armor was stronger than ever. But all of this, was a performance. It was a desperate, terrifying, high-wire act, because the man inside the armor, the real Jim Gordon, was at war. The Layla catastrophe, the failure of the band, the perceived betrayal by Rita Coolidge, the explosion of fame after the fact, had been the final traumatizing proof his illness needed. His deepest, darkest paranoid delusions had been validated. The world was out to get him. They were stealing from him. They were watching him. The voices he had been hearing since he was 16 were no longer whispers. They were a constant, tormenting chorus. This is the unimaginable horror of his 1970s existence. Imagine walking into a studio, sitting down at your kit, and seeing John Lennon on the other side of the glass. He's counting off the song, and as he counts, a voice in your head as clear as Lennon's is screaming at you. It's screaming that John is part of the conspiracy, that he knows, that he's in league with Rita, that this session is a trap, that the headphones are a device to send you secret, threatening messages. This is what was happening. According to Joel Selvin's 2023 book, Drums and Demons, Gordon was by this point actively, floridly psychotic during these legendary sessions. He would complain to baffled engineers that the click track was insulting him. He would pull off his headphones, convinced he was being spied on. He would fly into sudden, inexplicable rages. And then the count-in would finish, and the reliable pro would take over. For 3 minutes, the armor would hold. The illness, the voices, the terror, it would all be channeled by some superhuman act of will into the performance. He would lay down a perfect take, flawless. The beat that would define the song. Then the song would end, the red light would go off, and the voices would rush back in. Can you imagine the sheer psychic cost of that? The exhausting, terrifying, minute-by-minute battle to perform sanity? To be a studio gun for John Lennon while your own mind is trying to kill you? He needed help. He was drowning. But in the drug-fueled, hedonistic, anything-goes world of 1970s, Hollywood, his behavior wasn't seen as a symptom of a profound medical illness. It was just Jim being Jim. When he had a paranoid outburst, it was, oh, Jim's just high. When he was erratic, he's just a rock star. When he was deep in a catatonic, depressive state, he's just coming down. The drug culture of the LA scene was the perfect camouflage. It normalized the insane. His illness was able to hide in plain sight, dismissed by everyone, including himself, as just another part of the rock and roll lifestyle. And he was, of course, using those drugs to cope. The cocaine, he found, was a powerful, if temporary, weapon, a stimulant that could, for a short time, organize his mind, giving him a laser-like focus that allowed him to cut through the psychotic fog and function. It allowed him to do the work, but it was a devil's bargain. The stimulant was also feeding the mania, feeding the paranoia, and the crashes, the coming down, were getting deeper, darker, and more terrifying. The voices were louder in the silence. He was a man running on a treadmill that was accelerating, and the only way to stay on was to run faster, which only made the treadmill speed up. He was, quite literally, drugging himself to function, and the drugs were destroying his brain. And then, in the midst of this waking nightmare, his psychosis fixated on its ultimate target. And then, in the midst of this waking nightmare, his psychosis fixated on its ultimate targets, the real-life pressures of marriage and the phantom betrayal of Rita Coolidge. He had married a flight attendant named Jill Barebe in 1969. By the mid-70s, that marriage was completely disintegrating under the strain of his illness, his escalating drug use, and his terrifying, erratic behavior. At home, the reliable pro armor was off, and the man underneath was terrifying. But his true psychological obsession, the central figure in his paranoid delusion, remained Rita. The divorce from his actual wife, Jill, became in his psychotic mind hopelessly entangled with his perceived betrayal by Rita Coolidge. The failure of his real marriage was, to him, just more proof of the Layla conspiracy. It proved he was unlovable. It proved he was being persecuted. His real-world failure and his delusional obsession had merged into one indistinguishable nightmare. This was the point of no return. By 1977, he was 32 years old. He was on paper a living legend, the king of his craft. In reality, he was a hollow man, a shell, his mind now almost completely overrun by the disease. The voices were no longer just a chorus, they were becoming a voice, a single dominant persecutory voice, and the work, the one thing that had kept him tethered to reality, the one place his armor still held, was starting to dry up. The reliable pro was finally becoming unreliable. He was showing up to sessions late or not at all. His paranoia was no longer a quiet internal struggle. It was exploding in the studio. He was picking fights with producers. He was accusing bandmates of stealing. He was simply becoming too difficult to work with, even by the lax standards of the 70s. The music world is a shark tank. It doesn't matter if you're a genius, if you're difficult, if you're unreliable. The phone stops ringing. And for Jim Gordon, the phone was stopping. He was spiraling. He was isolated. His marriage was a wreck, and his identity as the go-to man was dissolving. He was, for the first time since he was 16, failing. He was briefly hospitalized in 1979, a minor breakdown. But it was, once again, misdiagnosed. It was drug-induced psychosis. It was exhaustion. It was cocaine. No one, not one doctor, not one friend, not one producer, not one family member, saw the truth. No one named the disease that had been growing untreated for almost 2 decades. No one said the word schizophrenia. They gave him some tranquilizers. They told him to clean up, and they sent him back out, back to his empty house, back to the drugs, back to the voices. By 1980, the 1970s, his golden, terrible decade were over. And so essentially was his career. He was 35 years old. The phone was for the most part silent. The armor, the one he had started building as a 16-year-old kid to hide his secret, was now finally gone. He was alone. In the silence of his LA home, there was no click track, there was no producer, there was no music. There was nothing left to drown them out. There was only him and the voices. This was the new sound, the sound of 1980. And for a man with untreated, severe paranoid schizophrenia, this new, crushing silence was the most dangerous state imaginable. His entire life, the work had been his anchor, the armor of the reliable pro, the fortress of the studio, the deafening, glorious noise of his own drumming. It wasn't just a career. It was a grid. It was a framework that held his fracturing mind together. The structure of the session, the demands of the producer, the unambiguous mathematical precision of the music. It was the only order he had, a defense against the chaos of his own brain. Now that framework was gone. The industry that had used his genius as fuel had now, just as casually, discarded him. Jim Gordon, in 1980, was a man in freefall. He was isolated, a king deposed with no kingdom to rule. He was untethered. He was adrift in a sea of empty days with no click track to follow. And in that terrifying empty space, the voices had all the room in the world to grow. The drugs, which had once been his tool to manage the work, now became the work itself. Cocaine was no longer for focus, it was for survival. Alcohol was no longer for relaxation, it was for oblivion. He was in a full-blown, debilitating cycle of addiction, but the addiction itself was just a symptom, a desperate, failing attempt to self-medicate a terror that was now constant. The voices, which had been a chorus, were starting to consolidate. They were no longer just random paranoid whispers. They were organizing. They were taking on a personality, a purpose. They were building their own narrative. And then, on December 8th, 1980, the outside world provided a new devastating piece of evidence for his psychosis. For the world, this was a collective trauma, a day of global mourning. For Jim Gordon, it was something else entirely. This was not a distant celebrity. This was John, the man he had played with, the man he had laughed with, the man who, in his mind, was part of his golden age. A healthy mind reacts with grief, with shock. A paranoid, schizophrenic mind reacts differently. His illness, his psychosis, which is always looking for patterns, for proof of the conspiracy, immediately absorbed this event. It twisted it. This was not a random act of a deranged fan. This was, in his mind, part of the conspiracy. This was a warning. This was a message. The forces that were out to get him, the ones who stole Layla, the ones who ruined his career, they had now gotten John. His paranoia, his delusions of reference, his magical thinking, or it all coalesced. He began to feel a profound delusional guilt. He should have known. He should have warned him. He should have protected him. He was, in his mind, a failure not just as a musician, but as a protector. Lennon's murder threw him off the cliff. His isolation became total. He was now a hermit, a prisoner in his own home, convinced the forces were coming for him next. He was terrified. And in this state of ultimate terror, the voices, which had been a disorganized mob, now found their leader. His psychosis, in its need to create a persecutor, a single identifiable source for all his pain, dug deep into his psyche. Past the betrayals, past the drugs, past the studios, it dug all the way back to the beginning. It dug back to the first moment of conflict, to the first voice of authority in his life, the first person who in his mind had ever tried to control him, to stop him, to deny him his identity. The voices, the terrifying, tormenting, relentless voices, began to sound in his head exactly like his mother, Osa Marie. This is the final and most horrific stage of the tragedy. It was not, in his mind, Osa Marie herself. It was a version of Osa Marie, a phantom built by the illness. It was the Osa Marie who, in his memory, had forced the piano on him, the instrument of rigid classical control. It was the Osa Marie who had rejected his drums, the instrument of his liberation and identity. It was the Osa Marie who, in his paranoid logic, had been the original force that tried to make him normal, that tried to stop his genius. In his fractured psychotic reality, the woman who had raised him, the woman who was, in real life, a quiet, 71-year-old retiree living in North Hollywood, became the living, breathing human embodiment of the conspiracy that had destroyed his life. She became, in his mind, the source of all the voices. He began obsessively to hear her, not just as a memory, but as an active auditory command hallucination. The voice was in his house. It was in his head. It was her. And it was tormenting him. It was, he believed, her voice that had been beamed into his headphones at the Lennon session. It was her voice that had colluded with Rita Coolidge to steal Layla. It was her voice that had convinced the producers to stop calling. It was her voice that was now 24 hours a day telling him he was a failure, that he was worthless, that he was and always had been the invisible boy. His mind had created the perfect, inescapable torture chamber. He was now, by 1982, in a constant state of psychotic war. He was fighting his own mother. He was screaming at the walls. He was, by all accounts, a man who was no longer there. He was, he would later tell police, fighting for his own soul. The voice, this Osa Marie voice, was, he believed, trying to kill him. It was trying to take him over. And then the nature of the voices changed. They weren't just insulting him anymore. They weren't just persecuting him. They began to give him an out. They began to give him a mission. They began to give him a command. The Osa Marie voice, his chief tormentor, had to be stopped. It was, in his mind, a simple binary choice, a choice of pure psychotic logic. It was her or him. He resisted. For months, for maybe even a year, he resisted. He was still somewhere deep inside, the reliable pro. He was still somewhere Jim. He fought. He would later lucidly describe the agony of this period. He would describe laying on the floor, his hands over his ears, screaming at the voices to get out. He would beg, he would pray, but the illness was too strong. The drugs had burned away any last rational defense. The Osa Marie voice was relentless. It was, he came to believe, a demon, an evil. And the other voices, the good voices, were telling him there was only one way to make it stop. There was only one way to be free. He had to kill her. He had to kill the source of the voices. He had to kill his mother. In the days leading up to June 3rd, 1983, Jim Gordon ceased to be a functioning human. He wasn't eating. He wasn't sleeping. He was a ghost, a hollowed-out man waiting for his instructions. The reliable pro, the man defined by his perfect, precise control, was now at last an absolute, perfect, and obedient slave to the chaos in his head. On the morning of June 3rd, 1983, the voices gave their final, undeniable command. He took a hammer, he took a butcher knife, and he drove in a state of calm, psychotic certainty to his 71-year-old mother's apartment in North Hollywood. She let him in. He was her son. What happened next is not an act of anger. It is not a crime of passion. It is the single most horrific and most tragic act in this entire story. It is an act of psychotic obedience. Jim Gordon was not in his mind killing his mother. He was in his mind exorcising a demon. He was killing the witch. He was destroying the voice that had tortured him, he believed, for 20 years. He was in his mind saving his own life. He attacked Osa Marie with the hammer. He was, he would later say, in a trance. The reliable pro, the man of perfect polyrhythmic control, was now applying that same detached mechanical precision to a new terrible task. When the hammer wasn't enough, when his mother, the real Osa Marie, the 71-year-old woman, confused, terrified, and dying, wouldn't be quiet. He went to the kitchen. He returned with a butcher knife. When the police arrived, summoned by a neighbor who heard the screams, they found a scene of absolute, unimaginable horror, and they found Jim Gordon. He was sitting. He was calm. He was, by one officer's report, in a state of catatonic shock, rocking gently. He was at last quiet. The act was done. The screaming, both inside his head and out, had been replaced by a deafening catatonic numbness. He was arrested passively. He did not resist. He was coherent, and he confessed calmly, rationally to the entire thing. He told the detectives in a flat, detached voice why he had to do it. He said simply that his mother was a demon, that she had been torturing him, that the voices had commanded him, and that he had at last obeyed. The invisible boy was, at last, seen. The ghost in the machine was, at last, on the front page of every newspaper in the world. Jim Gordon, the drummer for Layla, the man who had played with gods, was a monster. The music was over. The trial and the long, long silence were about to begin. The trial in 1984 was a formality. It was a post-mortem. The real story, the war inside Jim Gordon's mind, was already over. The voices had won. Now it was just the world of order, the courts, the law, the press, trying to make sense of the chaos he had unleashed. He was a puzzle the world could not solve. On the one hand, there was the evidence, a brutal, horrific crime, a confession, a man who, by all appearances, was coherent. The prosecution naturally painted a picture of a monster, a drug-addled, washed-up rock star who in a fit of rage had murdered his mother. On the other hand, there was the defense. His lawyers, for the first time, said the word that had been hiding in the shadows of his entire life, paranoid schizophrenia. They argued correctly that Jim Gordon was not evil. He was profoundly, medically, and systemically ill. He was, they argued, legally insane at the time of the act. But in 1984, the world and the legal system had little patience for such a defense. It was seen as an excuse, a rock star defense. The press in a frenzy could not reconcile the two Jims. This was the man who wrote the Layla Coda. This was the man who had played with John Lennon. And this was the man who had used a hammer on his 71-year-old mother. The media and the jury chose the narrative that was easier to understand. The monster. He was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury acknowledged his illness, but ruled that he had known on some level what he was doing. The sentence was 16 years to life. The gavel fell. He was the ultimate reliable pro, the studio gun who never missed. And then Jim Gordon disappeared. He was sent to the California Men's Colony and later transferred to a dedicated prison hospital, Coalinga State Hospital. He was inmate number C86431, and for the first time in his 39 years, Jim Gordon received actual sustained medical treatment. He was at last diagnosed. He was at last medicated. The antipsychotic drugs, the daily therapy, the structured, controlled environment of the hospital, it worked. The voices, the ones that had screamed at him, tormented him, and commanded him, finally, after 25 years, went quiet. And who was the man left behind? Who was Jim Gordon without the voices? He was the reliable pro. In a final, tragic, and profound irony, the real Jim Gordon, the man underneath the illness, was exactly the man he had pretended to be. He was quiet. He was polite. He was intelligent. He was gentle. He was, by all accounts from the hospital staff, a model patient. He was the invisible boy from the valley, the jazz kid. He followed the rules. He caused no trouble. He showed up on time. He took his medication. He was, in the sterile, ordered world of the prison hospital, perfectly reliable. He was at last in a place that could manage him, a place with no ambiguity, no invisible industry rules, no paranoid conspiracies, just walls, medicine, and a schedule. His life, which had been a chaotic, fiery, accelerating comet, now became a single, unchanging, stagnant dot. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, the months into years, the years into decades. Jim Gordon, the man whose hands had defined the rhythm of a generation, was now living a life without rhythm, a life of pure, monotonous, and endless time. And while he was inside, frozen in that medicated institutional silence, his other self, his ghost, was louder than ever. The 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. His music was everywhere. Martin Scorsese used his piano masterpiece in Goodfellas to score a montage of betrayal and death. The song had become a cultural touchstone. It was on commercials for cars. It was played at weddings. The ultimate song of love and romance. A song written in a psychotic, paranoid, manic episode about a stolen love. The irony was grotesque. The world was, quite literally, dancing to the sound of his madness. While Jim Gordon sat in a concrete room, His Pet Sounds drum work was being deconstructed by music schools, lionized as the pinnacle of percussive art. Modern Drummer magazine in 2023 would call him the most important and influential session drummer of his generation. In the year 2000, while inmate C86431 was lining up for his medication, Jim Gordon was being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the sideman category. He was a legend. He was a god. He was an invisible man. He was a forgotten pioneer, as Rolling Stone would one day call him. He was a tragic legend. He was in his cell just Jim, and he was trapped not just by the walls, but by the very illness that had put him there. The parole hearings began 1992, 1997, 2004, 2013, 2018. Again and again and again, he was denied. Why? He was a model patient. He was medicated. He was 70 years old. He was no conceivable threat to society. He was denied because he could not convince the parole board that he was cured. He was denied because of a devastating central and insoluble catch-22. The parole board needs to see remorse. They need a prisoner to take full responsibility for his crime, to say, I did it. I knew what I was doing, and I am sorry. Jim Gordon couldn't say that, not because he was arrogant, not because he was unfeeling, but because in his mind he hadn't done it. The illness had so completely and permanently rewritten his own history that he himself could not untangle it. He would sit there, a calm, medicated 70-year-old man, and try to explain politely that he hadn't killed his mother. The voices had, the demon had, the conspiracy had. He was, he would argue, a victim too. The parole board saw a man who was out of touch with reality, a man who lacked insight, a man who still, after 30 years, could not take responsibility for his crime. He was denied and denied and denied again. He was trapped forever by the very delusion that had caused the crime in the first place. His illness had become his permanent, inescapable jailer. He was too sick to ever be considered well enough to be set free. He was a ghost in the system. His old friends, the gods he had played with, were silent. The industry that had made billions from his talent sent no letters. He had, in his final catastrophic act, broken the one unspoken rule of the reliable pro. He had become a problem, and the industry erased him. But there was one small final flicker of the man inside. According to Joel Selvin's 2023 book, Drums and Demons, a book that finally, 40 years later, told the whole story, Jim Gordon, at some point during his long, silent incarceration, wrote a private letter. It was addressed to Eric Clapton. It wasn't a demand for royalties. It wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't a paranoid accusation. It was just a few simple words from a quiet man in a hospital ward. It reportedly said, "Forgive me." Forgive him for what? The question hangs in the air unanswered. Forgive him for the murder? For the collapse of the Dominos? For the paranoia? For the fist fight? Or was it, in some deep, sane, and lucid corner of his soul, a final heartbreaking apology from the reliable pro? A final, "I'm sorry," for failing at last to keep the armor intact. On March 13th, 2023, inmate C86431, James Beck Gordon, died alone in his prison hospital bed. He was 77 years old. The cause of death was natural causes, after a long, hopeless life with schizophrenia. The music finally was over. The news of his death sparked a whiplash of cognitive dissonance across the world. The obituaries were a paradox. Jim Gordon, Layla drummer, and convicted murderer, dies at 77. The world was forced, one last time, to hold the two Jims in their hands. The genius and the monster But now, in 2023, the world was different than it was in 1984. We had a new language. We had a new understanding of mental health. The release of Selvig's book in 2023, with a powerful reflective foreword by Eric Clapton, an act of public final forgiveness, cemented the new narrative. The tributes that poured in from Dave Grohl, from Modern Drummer, from Rolling Stone, they didn't just celebrate the ghost, they told the whole story. And in that telling, the narrative at last shifted. Jim Gordon was not a monster. He was a casualty. He was the victim of a perfect and perfectly tragic storm. So, how? How does this happen? We have to go back to the beginning. How does the man who wrote that melody commit that act? The answer is because of the melody. Jim Gordon's story is not a story of rock and roll excess. It is a story of a medical illness, a profound biological brain disease that was, from the age of 16, ignored. It was a story of silence. It was the silence of a terrified 16-year-old boy who knew instinctively that his madness was a secret he had to hide. It was the silence of a family that mistook the symptoms for teenage moods. And, most devastatingly, it was the silence of an industry. The 1970s Hollywood music scene was the single worst, most dangerous environment on earth for a man like Jim Gordon. It was a world that normalized his symptoms. His mania was creativity. His paranoia was drug-fueled. His social withdrawal was eccentricity. The industry didn't just ignore his illness, it fed it. It provided the very medicine, the cocaine, the alcohol, the nonstop pressure that acted as gasoline on the fire of his psychosis. The industry didn't want a human being, it wanted a reliable pro. It wanted a studio gun. It wanted the armor. And Jim Gordon, in his desperate, lifelong performance, gave them exactly what they wanted. He performed sanity so convincingly for so long that when his mind finally, inevitably, and catastrophically shattered, there was no one left to catch him. He hadn't fallen from grace. He had been hollowed out from the inside for 25 years, and no one noticed. That is his legacy. It's a legacy in two irreconcilable parts. There is the music, the immortal, brilliant, perfect work, the Layla coda, the Pet Sounds groove. It is the sound of his genius, the sound of the armor at its strongest. And then there is the warning. His life is a testament to the thousands of others who suffer in silence. Their illness is invisible, their cries for help mistaken for something else. He is the ultimate tragic symbol of what happens when we celebrate the genius, but ignore the human. When we demand the armor, but refuse to look at the man dying inside it. In the end, we are left with that one perfect, heartbreaking paradox. The Layla coda. It is perhaps the only piece of music in history that is at once one of the most beautiful love songs ever written and a field recording, a perfect, clinical audio document of a great mind at the height of its power, right at the very moment it was beginning to beautifully and terrifyingly come apart.